You're a good woman, Zariah, but good is just another word for boring. I'm moving into a different world now.
Min-Jae Kwon didn't even look up from his phone when he pushed the thick, manila envelope across the marble desk. The air in the penthouse office was cold, smelling of expensive cologne and the metallic scent of a city that never sleeps. Inside that envelope was a divorce decree, the official end to 5 years of marriage. "You're a good woman, Zariah," Min-Jae said, his voice as flat as a dial tone. "But good is just another word for boring. I'm moving into a different world now. A world of high-fashion models, global power, and names that make people tremble. You're a nurse. You belong in a hospital hallway, not in a mafia boardroom." Zariah Monroe looked at the man she had supported back when he was just a middle manager with a dream. She remembered the nights she worked double shifts at the hospital just so he could afford the tailored suits he used to look the part for his father's company. Now, those same suits were being used to shield a heart that had turned to stone. Standing behind him was a tall, blonde model in a red silk dress. The woman Min-Jae claimed was status appropriate. Zariah didn't cry. She didn't scream or beg for him to remember their late-night coffee talks or the way he used to lean on her when the world felt too heavy. Instead, she felt a strange, quiet click in her heart, the sound of a lock turning. She picked up the pen and signed her name with a hand that didn't shake. What Min-Jae didn't know was that Zariah was carrying more than just her dignity out of that room. Hidden in her purse was a positive pregnancy test, only 3 weeks old. She had come here to tell him they were finally going to be a family. But looking at the cold stranger in front of her, she realized that Min-Jae Kwon didn't deserve a family. He deserved exactly what he asked for, a life full of shiny, expensive things that had no soul. "I hope she's worth it, Min-Jae," Zariah said softly, her eyes locking onto his for the last time. "Because once I walk out that door, I don't exist to you anymore. Don't look for me. Don't call me. Just remember this moment when your status finally leaves you lonely." She turned and walked out, the sound of her heels echoing like a countdown. Min-Jae just laughed and poured a drink, unaware that he had just handed a divorce to the only person who could have saved his empire, and he had no idea that one day she would be the one holding the contracts that decided his future. The elevator ride down from the penthouse felt like it lasted a lifetime. Zariah stood perfectly still, watching the floor numbers count down: 50, 49, 48. Every floor felt like a year of her life she was leaving behind. By the time the doors opened into the lobby, she wasn't the boring nurse anymore. She was a woman on a mission. She walked past the security guards who used to bow to her. Today, they didn't even look up from their desks. They already knew. In Min-Jae's world, news of a replacement traveled faster than light. Zariah stepped out into the humid evening air and didn't call for the private car that usually picked her up. Instead, she started walking. She ducked into a small, quiet pharmacy 3 blocks away. Her heart was thumping against her ribs like a trapped bird. She bought a second pregnancy test, just to be absolutely sure. She went into the back of a nearby coffee shop, the kind of place Min-Jae would never step foot in. 2 minutes later, the result was the same. 2 pink lines. Zariah sat at a small wooden table, her hands shaking as she touched her stomach. "It's just you and me now, little one," she whispered. She knew how the Kwon family worked. If Min-Jae's mother found out there was an heir, she would try to take the baby and throw Zariah away for good. The Kwon family had deep roots in the Korean mafia, and they didn't play fair. They used fear and power to get what they wanted. She pulled her phone out of her pocket. She didn't call her mom or her best friend. She called a number she had saved a long time ago for an old friend who specialized in disappearing. "I need out," Zariah said when the man answered. "Everything. My bank accounts, my social media, and my records. I need a new start where the Kwon family can't find me." "That costs a lot of money, Zariah," the voice on the other end warned. Zariah looked at the 4-carat diamond ring on her finger, the one Min-Jae gave her before he decided she was too plain for his new life. It was worth more than enough to buy a new identity and a ticket to London. "I have the payment," she said, her voice turning as cold as Min-Jae's. "Just get it done before the sun comes up." As she walked toward the train station, she saw a giant digital billboard. It showed Min-Jae and his new model girlfriend at a gala. They looked perfect. Zariah took one last look at the man she used to love. Then she turned her back on the screen and disappeared into the crowd. As the train pulled away, Zariah's phone buzzed one last time. It was a text from Min-Jae. Don't forget to leave the house keys with the guard. Try to find someone more your speed, Zariah. She didn't reply. She threw the SIM card into a trash can and closed her eyes, imagining a future where she was the one holding all the cards. Min-Jae Kwon woke up the next morning feeling like the king of the world. He was in his giant penthouse. The sun was shining off the glass buildings of Beverly Hills, and he finally had the perfect life he wanted. He spent the morning taking photos with his new model girlfriend, posting them online to show everyone that he was moving up in the world. He expected Zariah to call him crying, or maybe send a long email begging for a second chance. That's what boring people did, right? They clung to the past because they had nothing else. By noon, Min-Jae realized he hadn't heard a peep from her. He checked his phone. No missed calls. No texts. He called the security guard at their old house to see if she had left the keys like he ordered in his last mean text. "Sir," the guard said, sounding confused. "She was here at 3 a.m. She didn't just leave the keys. She left everything. The house is totally empty of her stuff. Even the pictures on the walls are gone." Min-Jae frowned. He told himself she was just being dramatic. She was probably hiding at a friend's house, waiting for him to feel bad. But as the days turned into a week, a strange feeling started to grow in his stomach. It wasn't guilt. Min-Jae didn't really do guilt. It was a hit to his ego. How could she just leave without making a scene? He called his head of security, a tough man named Minu who had been with the Kwon family back in Korea. "Find her," Min-Jae ordered. "She's probably staying in some cheap motel. I want to make sure she's not talking to the press about our divorce. My family's reputation is too important." Minu came back 2 days later, and for the first time in years, he looked worried. "Sir, we have a problem. Zariah Monroe is gone. And I don't mean she moved to the next town. I mean, her phone number is disconnected. Her bank accounts are closed. She even wiped her medical records from the hospital where she worked." Min-Jae sat back in his leather chair, stunned. "That's impossible. She's a nurse. She doesn't know how to disappear like that." "She sold her wedding ring," Minu added quietly. "She used the cash to hire a professional cleaner. Someone who helps people vanish. We tracked a credit card hit at the airport, but it was a dead end. She bought 3 different tickets to 3 different countries, but she only got on one plane. We don't know which one." Min-Jae felt a flicker of anger. He was a man who sat on boards with powerful people and moved markets with a single deal. He was used to being the one in control. The idea that Zariah, the woman he called boring, had outmaneuvered his entire security team made his blood boil. He didn't know that while he was searching the dark corners of Los Angeles, Zariah was already thousands of miles away. 6,000 miles away, in a gray and rainy part of London, Zariah was standing in a tiny, cramped apartment. It smelled like old dust and cabbage, a far cry from the marble floors of the Kwon penthouse. Her feet ached, and her back was sore from carrying her heavy suitcase up 3 flights of stairs. She walked over to the window and looked out at the street. She was tired, she was lonely, and she was scared. But as she touched her stomach, she felt a surge of strength. She wasn't just Zariah anymore. She was a mother. And a mother would do anything to protect her child from a family that used people like chess pieces. She had exactly enough money to last her 6 months if she was careful. She spent her days working at a small community clinic, wearing a plain uniform and keeping her head down. She didn't use her real name at work. To everyone in London, she was just Z, the quiet nurse who worked the late shifts that nobody else wanted. One night, while she was checking on a patient in the emergency room, an elderly man was brought in. He was dressed in expensive clothes that were now torn and bloody from a car accident. The other doctors were busy, so Zariah stepped in. She noticed something they didn't, a rare reaction he was having to the heart medicine they were trying to give him. Because she had spent years watching over Min-Jae's father and his heart condition, she knew exactly what to do. She saved the man's life that night. He was a tech billionaire named Elias Thorne, a man who had more money than Min-Jae could ever dream of, but no family to speak of. When he woke up, he asked for the nurse who had saved him. "Why did you catch that?" Elias asked, his voice weak but curious. The other doctors missed it. Zariah just gave him a small, sad smile. "I spent a long time taking care of someone who didn't appreciate it," she said. "I learned to pay attention to the small things." Elias looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the intelligence in her eyes and the way her hands didn't shake. He saw a woman who was hiding a giant spirit in a tiny clinic. "You're wasted here, Z," Elias said. "People like us, we're survivors. But survival isn't enough. You should be winning." Back in Beverly Hills, Min-Jae was at a fancy party with his model girlfriend, but he wasn't having fun. He kept looking at the door, hoping to see a boring woman walk in so he could tell her off. He didn't know that Zariah had just met the man who would help her build an empire that would eventually swallow his own. He also didn't know that in a small London clinic, a doctor was looking at an ultrasound and saying, "Everything looks perfect, Zariah. You're having a boy." The first year in London was a blur of exhaustion and cheap coffee. Zariah's life was no longer about silk sheets and private chefs. It was about counting pennies to make sure she could pay for her prenatal vitamins. She lived in a small flat where the heater whistled, but she didn't care. For the first time, she wasn't living under the shadow of the Kwon family name. She was free. When her son, Leo, was born, Zariah looked at his face and caught her breath. He had Min-Jae's sharp jawline and those same deep, intense eyes. It was a constant reminder of the man who had called her boring, but she vowed that Leo would never grow up to be cold or cruel. He would be a man of character. While raising a newborn, Zariah didn't stop moving. She remembered what Elias Thorne, the billionaire she saved, had told her: survival isn't enough. Elias stayed true to his word. He became a mentor to her, but he didn't just hand her money. He knew that for a woman like Zariah to truly win, she had to build her own power. "I'm a tech guy, Zariah," Elias told her one evening while she was studying for a business degree on her laptop, with baby Leo asleep in a carrier on her chest. "But you understand people. You spent years as a nurse watching how bodies work and years as a mafia wife watching how power works. Combine those two. Build something that people actually need." Zariah took his advice. She noticed that the biotech industry was full of brilliant scientists who didn't know how to talk to patients and businessmen who didn't care about health. Using her medical background and the negotiation tactics she had quietly observed in Min-Jae's boardroom, she started a small consulting firm called Monroe Health Tech. By year 3, the boring nurse was gone. In her place was a woman who could walk into a room of investors and command total silence. She was smart, she was focused, and she was relentless. She didn't buy fancy cars or jewelry. She poured every cent back into the company. She was building a weapon, and that weapon was her success. Meanwhile, back in Beverly Hills, Min-Jae's world was slowly beginning to crack. His model wife, the one he thought would make him look like a king, had become his biggest headache. She didn't care about his business. She only cared about the Kwon credit cards. Min-Jae found himself constantly arguing with his mother, who was angry that he had let his stable wife disappear. "Zariah kept your house in order, Min-Jae," his mother snapped during a tense dinner. "Now your personal life is a circus, and it's making the family look weak. The elders in Busan are asking questions. A man who can't control his own home can't run an empire." Min-Jae tried to ignore her, but deep down, he knew she was right. Kwon Global was facing trouble. A new, mysterious company from Europe was quietly buying up their patents and hiring away their best scientists. Min-Jae didn't realize it was Zariah. To him, she was still just a memory of a woman who liked tea and quiet nights. A woman who was probably struggling to get by somewhere. By year 5, Elias Thorne passed away quietly. He left Zariah his most valuable asset, a massive investment fund and a seat at the head of Price & Company International. Zariah stood at his funeral in a perfectly tailored black suit, her hair in a sleek bun, looking every bit the so she had become. She looked at her son, Leo, who was now 4 years old. He was smart, kind, and the center of her world. "Is it time, Mommy?" Leo asked, holding her hand. "Yes, Leo," Zariah said, her eyes turning toward the horizon. "It's time to go back and finish what we started." Back in California, Min-Jae received a frantic email from his CFO. "Sir, we've been outplayed. A company called Price & Company just initiated a hostile takeover of our shipping division. If we don't meet their CEO and sign a deal by Friday, we're going to lose everything." Min-Jae slammed his fist on the desk. "Who is the CEO? Give me a name." The CFO looked at his tablet, his face pale. "They don't use a name, sir. Just a signature, the letter Z." Min-Jae Kwon was a man who believed that power was built on fear and high-end labels. But for the first time in his life, the labels weren't protecting him. The office at Kwon Global Industries, once a place of absolute control, now felt like a cage. Every time the phone rang, it was bad news. His stock prices were dropping faster than a stone in a well. His partners in South Korea were sending him cold, formal letters asking why his American branch was losing so much money. Min-Jae's perfect life with his model wife had turned into a nightmare. She didn't want to hear about debt or hostile takeovers. She just wanted her monthly allowance. "I didn't marry a man who worries about money, Min-Jae," she had snapped at him that morning, her eyes cold. "Fix it, or I'm leaving." Min-Jae realized then that he had traded a woman who supported him for a woman who only liked the shadow he cast when the sun was out. He sat at his desk, staring at a screen that showed a red line moving steadily downward. It was a visual map of his failure. A mystery company, Price & Company International, had been moving in the shadows for months. They hadn't used guns or threats like his grandfather's mafia friends would have. Instead, they used something much more dangerous: math and patience. They had quietly bought up his suppliers. They had paid off the banks that held his loans. They had even bought the land under his favorite hotel in Aspen. "Who are these people?" Min-Jae screamed, sweeping a stack of papers off his desk. Minu, his head of security, stood by the door. He looked older and more tired than he had 5 years ago. "We can't find a face, sir. Price & Company is owned by a private trust. But they just sent a final notice. They now own 51% of your debt. They are calling for a mandatory board meeting tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. to discuss the future leadership of this company." Min-Jae felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. "Leadership? This is my company. My father gave it to me." "Not anymore, sir," Minu said softly. "On paper, they own you." Min-Jae spent the night drinking expensive whiskey, trying to figure out a way to win. He thought about his grandfather's old stories, how the Kwon family never lost. But those were stories about a world that didn't exist anymore. In this world, the one with glass skyscrapers and digital bank accounts, he was being hunted by a ghost. While Min-Jae was falling apart, Zariah Monroe was standing on the balcony of a penthouse just a few miles away. The air in Beverly Hills felt the same as it had 5 years ago, but she was a completely different person. She wasn't the nurse in the plain uniform anymore. She was wearing a structured, cream-colored power suit that cost more than her old annual salary. Her skin was glowing, and her eyes were calm and steady. She looked inside the room at her son, Leo. He was sleeping peacefully, unaware that his mother was about to change their lives forever. Zariah had spent 5 years preparing for this. She had studied every deal Min-Jae made. She knew his weaknesses better than he knew them himself. He was arrogant. He thought people were boring if they weren't loud or flashy. That was his biggest mistake. He never expected the quiet ones to be the ones who were actually watching the exit doors. "Is everything ready?" Zariah asked as her assistant, a sharp woman she had hired in London, walked onto the balcony. "The papers are ready," CEO Monroe, the assistant said. "Min-Jae Kwon thinks he's meeting a group of investors to beg for a loan. He has no idea that he's meeting his new landlord." Zariah picked up a sleek leather folder labeled Acquisition Contract. She felt the weight of it in her hand. It wasn't just paper, it was justice. It was the answer to every mean thing he had said to her. It was the shield she had built for her son. "He called me boring," Zariah whispered to the wind, a small, cold smile touching her lips. "He thought I was a side character in his story. Tomorrow, he finds out I'm the one who wrote the ending." The next morning, Min-Jae stood in front of his boardroom doors. He straightened his navy suit and checked his reflection. He looked like a powerful man, but his hands were shaking. He pushed the doors open, expecting to see a room full of old men in gray suits. Instead, the room was empty except for one person sitting at the very head of the table, in his chair. The chair was turned toward the window, showing only the back of a woman's head and the glow of the morning sun. "I'm Min-Jae Kwon," he said, trying to make his voice sound deep and scary. "You wanted to see me?" The chair slowly rotated. Zariah looked him right in the eye, her face as calm as a frozen lake. "Actually, Min-Jae," she said, her voice smooth and powerful, "I wanted you to see me." The silence in the boardroom was so heavy it felt like it was crushing the air out of the room. Min-Jae stood frozen by the door, his hand still gripping the handle. He looked at the woman sitting in his chair, then at the acquisition folder on the table, then back at her face. He blinked several times, hoping his eyes were playing a trick on him. "Zariah," he finally whispered. His voice sounded thin and weak, not at all like the powerful mafia boss he pretended to be. Is that really you?" Zariah didn't move. She didn't smile, and she didn't look angry. She just sat there with a calm, controlled expression, her chin lifted slightly as she looked him up and down. She looked expensive, not the kind of expensive you buy at a mall, but the kind of expensive that comes from years of winning. Her emerald green power suit glowed under the office lights, making her look like a queen sitting on a throne. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Min-Jae," Zariah said. Her voice was steady and smooth, filled with a quiet authority that made Min-Jae feel small. "But I'm very much alive. And according to these papers, I'm the new owner of the air you're breathing in this building." Min-Jae finally found his legs and stumbled toward the table. He grabbed the folder and flipped it open, his fingers shaking so hard he almost ripped the pages. He saw the signatures, the bank stamps, and the name of the parent company, Price & Company International. He remembered her last name was Monroe, but Price was her maiden name. The name he had told her wasn't high status enough for his world. "This can't be right," Min-Jae stammered, his forehead glistening with a subtle stress shine. "You were a nurse. You didn't have 2 cents to your name when you left. How did you buy a global conglomerate? Who gave you this money?" "Nobody gave me anything, Min-Jae," Zariah replied, standing up slowly. She seemed to grow taller as she moved, visually dominating the space. "While you were busy chasing models and trying to look like a boss, I was actually becoming one. I built a biotech empire while you were busy running yours into the ground. You called me boring because I was stable. But stability is what allows you to see the moves your enemy is making before they even make them." She walked toward the giant glass window, looking out at the city. "I watched you gamble away your father's legacy. I watched you ignore your smartest employees. And then, I bought your debt for pennies on the dollar because nobody else wanted to touch a sinking ship." Min-Jae slumped into a side chair, clutching his head. The Mafia King was gone. He just looked like a man who had lost a bet he couldn't afford. He thought about his model wife, who was probably at home right now ordering more designer bags on a credit card that was about to be declined. He thought about his mother, who would never forgive him for losing the family name to the woman he threw away. "What do you want, Zariah?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Are you here for revenge? Do you want to see me crawl?" Zariah turned around. She looked at him with pity, which felt worse than anger. "I don't need to see you crawl, Min-Jae. You're already on the floor. I'm here for business. This meeting isn't a negotiation. It's an eviction." She tapped the acquisition contract on the table. "You have 24 hours to clear out your desk. You, your mother, and your status-appropriate wife are done. I'm taking over Kwon Global. I'm changing the name, and I'm firing the entire board of directors." Min-Jae looked up, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and a sudden, desperate realization. He looked at Zariah's face, really looked at her, and saw a strength he had completely missed for 5 years. But then, he noticed something else. A small gold locket around her neck. He remembered that locket. It was where she kept her most precious photos. 24 hours, Min-Jae repeated, his voice barely a whisper. Then, his eyes narrowed as a thought hit him. "Zariah, you've been gone for 5 years. You didn't just spend that time building a company, did you? You disappeared so completely that even my best men couldn't find you. What else were you hiding?" Zariah's calm face flickered for just a second, a tiny crack in her armor. She gripped her folder tighter. "That's none of your business, Min-Jae. Just sign the papers." But Min-Jae stood up, his mafia instincts finally kicking in. "It is my business if you were pregnant when you left." The tension in the boardroom was broken by the sound of clicking heels and a loud, sharp voice. The doors swung open, and Tiffany, the model Min-Jae had chosen over Zariah, marched in. She was wearing a red designer dress that screamed for attention, but in this room of cold steel and billion-dollar contracts, she looked out of place. "Min-Jae," she snapped, ignoring the fact that a meeting was happening. "My card was declined at the boutique. In front of everyone. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that is? Fix it right now." Min-Jae didn't look at her. He was still staring at Zariah, his mind spinning. "Tiffany, not now," he muttered, his voice shaking. "We have bigger problems." Tiffany finally noticed Zariah sitting at the head of the table. She squinted, trying to place the face. "Wait, is that the nurse? The boring one?" She let out a fake, high-pitched laugh. What is she doing in your chair? Did she come here to beg for her old job back? Zariah didn't even blink. She slowly closed her leather folder and looked at Tiffany with a calm, empty expression. Actually, Zariah said, her voice like silk, I'm the reason your card was declined. I bought the bank that owns your husband's credit line this morning, and I've already flagged your accounts for unnecessary spending. Tiffany's jaw dropped. She turned to Min-Jae, expecting him to roar with mafia fury and kick Zariah out. But Min-Jae just sat there, looking pale and defeated. Min-Jae, do something, Tiffany screamed, grabbing his arm. He pushed her hand away. She owns the company, Tiffany. She owns everything. When Tiffany realized the money was truly gone, her love vanished instantly. She didn't stay to comfort him. She didn't even stay to fight. She looked at Min-Jae with total disgust. You're a loser, she hissed. I'm not staying to watch you go broke. She turned on her heel and walked out, the sound of her heels fading down the hall. Min-Jae stood there, alone in the wreckage of his choices. He looked back at Zariah, and suddenly, he felt a desperate surge of memory. He remembered when he used to come home stressed, and Zariah would make him tea and listen to him without asking for a single thing. He missed that peace. He missed her. He walked around the table, trying to soften his face. He reached out as if to touch Zariah's hand, his voice dropping into a low, romantic tone he used to use years ago. Zariah, I see it now. I was a fool. I let the world get in my head. But look at what you've become. We could be the most powerful couple in the world. You have the money, and I have the name. We can start over. Forgive me, and let's build this together. Zariah pulled her hand back before he could touch her. She looked at him, and for the first time, she laughed, a short, cold sound. You think this is a movie, Min-Jae? You think you can throw a person away like a piece of trash and then pick them up when they turn into gold? I still love you, he lied, stepping closer, trying to look into her eyes with that mafia boss charm. I never stopped thinking about you. No, Zariah said, standing up and stepping away. You never stopped thinking about yourself. You don't love me. You love the power I just took from you. She walked toward the door, but stopped and looked back over her shoulder. And about that question you asked before Tiffany interrupted, about what else I was hiding. Min-Jae held his breath. I wasn't hiding a secret, Min-Jae, she said, her eyes flashing with a protective fire. I was protecting a life you gave up the right to know 5 years ago. Just as Zariah opened the door to leave, her phone rang. She answered it on speaker by accident while grabbing her bag. A small, bright voice filled the quiet boardroom. Mommy, are we going to see the big tall buildings now? You said we were almost done. Min-Jae's heart stopped. That voice. It sounded exactly like his own voice from the old home movies his mother kept. Zariah, Min-Jae gasped, his face turning ghostly white. Who was that? Zariah didn't answer. She stepped out of the room, and the heavy doors clicked shut, leaving Min-Jae alone in the silence. Min-Jae stood frozen in the center of the boardroom. The high-pitched voice of the little boy from Zariah's phone was still ringing in his ears. It was a sound that made his stomach do a slow, painful flip. He looked at the empty chair where Zariah had just been sitting, the chair that used to be his throne, and felt a wave of cold realization wash over him. He didn't go home to Tiffany. He didn't want to hear her complaining about her credit cards or her social status ever again. Instead, he went straight to his mother's estate. Mrs. Kwon was sitting in her garden, sipping tea and looking like a queen who hadn't realized her kingdom was burning down. Mother, Min-Jae said, his voice cracking as he sat across from her. Zariah is back, but she isn't a nurse anymore. She's the CEO of the company that just bought us out. His mother's hand stopped midair. She didn't look shocked. She looked annoyed. I told you that girl had more steel in her than you realized, Min-Jae. You called her boring because she didn't bark, but she was always watching. That's not all. Min-Jae leaned in, his eyes wide. I think she has a son. A boy who sounds just like I did when I was 5. She left 5 years ago, Mother. The math works. Mrs. Kwon's eyes turned sharp and cold, like a predator spotting its next meal. The mafia side of her personality suddenly took over. A son? A Kwon heir raised by a woman we kicked out? If that boy has our blood, he belongs to this family. He is the only thing we have left to leverage. She won't let us near him, Min-Jae said, remembering the fire in Zariah's eyes. Then we don't ask, his mother hissed. We find out where she's staying. We see the boy with our own eyes. While the Kwons were plotting, Zariah was back at her hotel suite, holding Leo close. She felt a deep sense of dread. She knew Min-Jae wasn't the smartest man, but he wasn't blind. That phone call had been a mistake. She had spent 5 years being a ghost, but now she was a target. "Mommy, why are you squeezing me so tight?" Leo asked, looking up at her with those familiar, dark eyes. "I just missed you today, baby," Zariah lied, kissing the top of his head. "We're going to be very busy for a few days. I need you to stay with your nanny and not go near the windows, okay? It's a game of hide and seek." Later that evening, Min-Jae couldn't help himself. He used his last bit of mafia influence to track Zariah's car to a private hotel in the hills. He didn't send his guards. He went alone. He parked across the street, sitting in the dark, watching the entrance. An hour later, he saw them. Zariah walked out into the small garden area of the hotel, holding a small boy's hand. The boy was wearing a little blue jacket and laughing as he tried to catch a butterfly. When the boy turned toward the light, Min-Jae gasped. It was like looking into a mirror from 30 years ago. The way the boy tilted his head, the way his ears were shaped, there was no doubt. Min-Jae felt a strange, hot lump in his throat. For 5 years, he had chased models and money, thinking they would make him a man. But looking at that boy, he realized he had missed the only thing that actually mattered. He felt a sudden urge to run across the street, to grab the boy, to tell Zariah he was sorry. But then he remembered the look on Zariah's face in the boardroom. She didn't want his apologies. She wanted his signature on an exit contract. Min-Jae reached for his car door, ready to step out, but a black SUV pulled up behind him. His mother's head of security stepped out and tapped on his window. "Your mother says to wait, sir. We have a plan to bring the boy home. We don't need Zariah's permission." Min-Jae looked at the security man, then back at his son playing in the garden. He had to choose, be the man his mother wanted, or finally be the man Zariah deserved. Min-Jae stared at his mother's head of security, a man named Min-Jae who had served the Kwon family's darker interests for decades. The threat in Min-Jae's voice was clear. The Kwon family didn't ask for what they wanted, they took it. But as Min-Jae looked back at the garden, he saw Zariah pick up Leo and spin him around. The boy's laughter was so bright it seemed to cut through the heavy Los Angeles smog. "Get out of the way, Min-Jae," Min-Jae said, his voice surprisingly firm. "I'm not doing this her way. Not tonight." Min-Jae bowed slightly, but his eyes remained cold. "Your mother won't be happy, sir. She believes the bloodline is more important than your feelings." Min-Jae ignored him and stepped out of the car. He didn't walk toward the garden like a mafia boss. He walked slowly, his shoulders slumped, feeling every bit of the 5 years he had wasted. He reached the gate of the hotel garden just as Zariah was putting Leo down. Zariah saw him immediately. Her body went stiff, and she pulled Leo behind her in an instant. It was a mother's instinct, fast and fierce. "What are you doing here, Min-Jae? I told you to stay away." "I saw him, Zariah," Min-Jae said, stopping 10 feet away. "He didn't try to get closer. I saw his face. You don't have to say anything. I know he's mine." Zariah's eyes darted to the dark SUV parked across the street, then back to Min-Jae. She could see the conflict on his face. He looked like the man she used to love, confused and hurting, but she couldn't trust that version of him anymore. "He isn't yours," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "He belongs to the woman you called boring. He belongs to the nurse you threw away. You don't get to claim him just because you're losing your company." "I don't care about the company anymore," Min-Jae shouted, then lowered his voice when he saw Leo looking at him with curious, wide eyes. "I care that I have a son I never knew. I care that you had to do all of this alone while I was being a fool." For a second, a tiny second, Zariah's heart softened. She saw the regret in his eyes. But then she remembered the transcript of his life over the last 5 years, the models, the arrogance, the cold way he treated everyone. "You're only saying this because you're at the bottom," she said. "If you were still the king of Kwon Global, you wouldn't be standing here. You'd be at a party." Suddenly, Leo stepped out from behind Zariah's legs. He looked at Min-Jae, then at the fancy watch on Min-Jae's wrist. "Are you the man from the office?" Leo asked. "Mommy said we were playing hide-and-seek with a man from an office." Min-Jae felt his heart break into a million pieces. He dropped to one knee, so he was at eye level with the boy. I am. I'm an old friend of your mom's." "Do you have a son?" Leo asked innocently. Min-Jae looked at Zariah, a tear finally escaping and rolling down his cheek. "I do," he whispered. but I was too stupid to know it. Zariah grabbed Leo's hand and started pulling him toward the hotel entrance. That's enough, Min-Jae. Leave us alone. My mother's trust is active, my company is strong, and I don't need a mafia family breathing down my neck. If I see your mother's cars near my son again, I will release every file I have on your family's illegal business in Busan. I'm not playing games. As Zariah disappeared inside, Min-Jae stood up and turned back to his car. But he didn't see Minu waiting for him. Instead, he saw his mother's SUV speeding away. His phone buzzed. It was a text from his mother. If you won't bring the heir home, I'll find a legal way to prove you are an unfit father and take him myself. Choose your side, Min-Jae. The woman who hates you, or the family that made you. Min-Jae looked at the closed hotel doors, then at the disappearing tail lights of his mother's car. He realized that to save his son, he might have to destroy his own mother. The next morning, the air in Beverly Hills felt thick and heavy, like a storm was coming. Min-Jae didn't go to the office he no longer owned. Instead, he met Minu in a dark corner of a quiet park. He knew his mother was already talking to her high-priced lawyers, trying to find a way to sue Zariah for custody of Leo. In the Kwon family, a male heir was seen as a trophy, and his mother was a woman who hated to lose trophies. Minu, you've worked for my family since before I was born, Min-Jae said, looking the older man in the eye. But I'm asking you to help me, not my mother. I need a DNA test, not for the courts, but for me. And I need to make sure my mother doesn't get her hands on the results first. Minu looked at the man he had watched grow up. He saw the desperation in Min-Jae's face, not the fake boss look, but the look of a father who was finally waking up. I can get it done quietly, sir. But if your mother finds out I'm helping you hide things from her, my life won't be worth a cent in Busan. I'll protect you, Min-Jae promised, though he wasn't sure if he even had the power to protect himself anymore. While Min-Jae was working in secret, Zariah was sitting in her new office, the one that used to belong to Min-Jae's father. She was looking at a legal letter that had just been hand-delivered. It was from the Kwon family lawyers. They were demanding a mandatory paternity test and claiming that Zariah had kidnapped a member of the Kwon bloodline by moving to London. Zariah felt a cold chill run down her spine. She knew the Kwon family was powerful, but she didn't realize they would move this fast. She picked up her desk phone and called her head of security. Double the guards at the hotel, and I want a private jet fueled and ready at LAX. If they try to touch my son, we are leaving the country tonight. She sat back in her chair, her heart racing. She had spent 5 years building her boring life into a fortress, but she realized that when it came to mafia families, walls weren't always enough. She needed someone on the inside. Just then, her private cell phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. My mother is coming for him today. Meet me at the old coffee shop on 4th Street. Come alone if you want to save Leo. Zariah knew it was Min-Jae. Every part of her told her it was a trap, but she also remembered the tears she saw on his face in the garden. She remembered the man he was before his mother's greed turned him into a monster. She arrived at the coffee shop 30 minutes later, wearing a large hat and sunglasses. Min-Jae was sitting in a back booth, looking like a man who hadn't slept in a week. He pushed a small, sealed envelope toward her. What is this? Zariah asked, her voice sharp. The truth, Min-Jae whispered. I got a fast-track DNA test using a hair from Leo's brush that I found in the garden. It's 99.9% match, Zariah. He's mine. But listen to me. My mother doesn't care about the DNA. She's already bribed a judge to sign an emergency order to take him for protection because of your mafia connections through me. Zariah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. That's a lie. I have no connections to that world. She's making them up, Min-Jae said, reaching out to grab her hand, but stopping himself. She's going to use my own reputation to ruin yours so she can take the boy. You have to leave. Now. I've blocked her security teams for 2 hours, but that's all the time I could buy you. Zariah looked at him, searching his eyes for the lie. But all she saw was a man who was finally choosing his son over his status. Zariah stood up, grabbing the envelope. Why are you helping me, Min-Jae? You could have used this to force me to stay. Min-Jae looked at the coffee cup, his voice trembling. Because you were right. I called you boring because I didn't understand what real strength looked like. Real strength is what you did for 5 years. My mother wants a trophy, but I want my son to be safe. Even if that means he never knows my name. As Zariah ran toward her car, She saw a black SUV turn the corner. It wasn't her security. It was his mother's. The black SUV didn't slow down as it jumped the curb, blocking Zariah's car just as she reached for the door. Zariah's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked back at the coffee shop window, but Min-Jae was already moving. He ran out of the shop, his face full of a fury she hadn't seen since the day he took over his father's business. "Stay back, Zariah," Min-Jae yelled. He stepped between her and the SUV as 4 men in dark suits climbed out. These weren't corporate security guards. They were the cleaners from the Busan side of the family. They were men who didn't care about lawyers or boardrooms. The lead man, a scarred veteran named Sang-hoon, bowed mockingly to Min-Jae. "Master Min-Jae, your mother is disappointed. She told us you might be having a moment of weakness. She sent us to make sure the boy is escorted to the family estate safely." "He's my son, Sang-hoon," Min-Jae said, his voice low and dangerous. "And I'm the head of this family. You take orders from me." Sang-hoon smiled, a cold, toothy look. "Actually, sir, your mother reminded us that you signed over your controlling shares of the family trust last night to save your skin. Technically, she's the boss again, and she wants her grandson." Zariah didn't wait to hear the rest. She knew she couldn't outrun professional mafia hitmen on foot. She remembered her training from the hospital. Stay calm, look for the exit. She scrambled into the driver's seat of her car, but before she could start the engine, Sang-hoon reached through the open window and grabbed the steering wheel. "The CEO shouldn't be driving herself," he hissed. Suddenly, a loud thwack echoed through the street. Min-Jae had grabbed a heavy metal chair from the coffee shop patio and slammed it into Sang-hoon's back. It was a messy, human move, not the polished fighting of a movie hero, but the desperate act of a father. "Go, Zariah. Get to the airport." Min-Jae screamed as he tackled Sang-hoon to the ground. Zariah didn't look back. She shifted the car into reverse, tires screaming as she backed away from the fight. She saw Min-Jae in her rearview mirror, struggling on the pavement as the other 3 men piled onto him. He was losing, but he was buying her seconds. Every second was a mile between the Kwons and her son. She drove like a woman possessed, weaving through the Beverly Hills traffic. She called her head of security on her hands-free set. "They're coming. Get Leo to the private hangar at LAX now. Do not wait for me. If I'm not there in 20 minutes, take off without me." "But ma'am, that's an order," she sobbed, the tears finally breaking through. As she sped toward the airport, she saw another black SUV in her side mirror. They were following her. Her mother's words about people leaving rang in her head. Her father had left. Min-Jae had left. But she would never leave Leo. Even if she had to crash this car to stop them, she would. Zariah reached the airport gates, but a police cruiser was already there, lights flashing. A tall man in a suit stood next to the officer, holding a piece of paper. It was the emergency custody order. "Zariah Monroe," the officer called out, signaling her to stop. "We have an order to take the child into protective custody. Please step out of the vehicle." Zariah looked at the police, then at the black SUV closing in from behind. She was trapped between the law and the mafia. She reached for her phone, looking at the one file she had hoped never to use, the secret evidence of the Kwon family's crimes. She had to decide. If she pushed the button, she would destroy the Kwon name forever, including Min-Jae. Zariah stared at the police officer and the lawyers standing by the hangar gates. Her hands were gripped so tight on the steering wheel that her knuckles were white. In her rearview mirror, the black SUV filled with Sang-hoon's men was slowing down, waiting like vultures for the law to do their dirty work. She looked at her phone. The file sat there. 5 years of collected secrets, bank transfers, and a legal shipping manifest that proved the Kwon family was still running the mafia empire Min-Jae's father claimed he had cleaned up. If she released it, the Kwon family would be erased. Min-Jae would go to prison along with his mother. But if she didn't, she would lose Leo. "Ma'am, step out of the car," the officer repeated, his hand moving toward his belt. Zariah took a deep breath. She didn't step out. Instead, she lowered her window just an inch. "Officer, before you execute that order, I need you to look at your tablet. My legal team just sent a priority file to the district attorney and the FBI. That custody order was signed based on a lie." The lawyer stepped forward, his face red with anger. "This is a legal document signed by a judge, Zariah. You can't talk your way out of this." "I'm not talking," Zariah said, her voice turning into the cold, powerful CEO voice that had crushed Min-Jae in the boardroom. "I'm reporting a crime. That man in the SUV behind me, he's a known associate of the Kwon syndicate. He's here to take my son. If you hand a child over to a mafia organization, your badge will be the first thing you lose." The officer paused, his radio crackling. A voice came through, loud and urgent. "Dispatch to Unit 4. Hold all action on the Monroe case. Federal agents are en route. The custody order has been flagged for fraud." The lawyer's jaw dropped. Behind her, the black SUV suddenly screeched its tires, pulling a dangerous U-turn to flee before the FBI arrived. Zariah didn't feel relief yet. She looked back at her phone. She hadn't pushed the release all button. She had only sent the files related to Min-Jae's mother and the specific lawyers who forged the papers. She had spared Min-Jae. Just then, a beat-up taxi slammed to a halt near the gate. Min-Jae stumbled out. His suit was torn, his lip was bleeding, and his eye was starting to swell shut. He didn't look like a CEO or a mafia boss. He looked like a man who had walked through fire. "Zariah," he shouted, waving his hands as the police moved to intercept him. "Is he safe? Is Leo on the plane?" Zariah stepped out of the car, her heart racing. "He's on the plane, Min-Jae. Why did you come here? The FBI is 5 minutes away. If you're here, they'll take you too." Min-Jae reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, old USB drive. "This is the rest of it. The codes to the offshore accounts my mother used to bribe the judge. I'm giving it to you. Use it to make sure she can never touch you or Leo again." "Min-Jae, if I give this to them, you're finished," Zariah whispered, looking at the man who once called her boring and divorced her. "I was finished the day I let you walk out of my office 5 years ago," Min-Jae said, a sad, honest smile touching his bruised face. "Go, Zariah. Take him back to London. Give him a life that isn't built on shadows." As the sound of sirens filled the air, Min-Jae turned his back to the plane and put his hands behind his head, ready to surrender to the police. But Zariah caught his arm. She looked at the plane, then at the police cars screaming toward them. "The FBI doesn't have your name on the warrant yet," Zariah said, her voice trembling. "I only sent his mother's files. You have 10 seconds to decide, Min-Jae. Do you stay here and pay for your family's sins, or do you get on that plane and start learning how to be a father?" The wind from the jet's engines whipped Zariah's hair across her face. The sirens were deafening now, red and blue lights reflecting off the silver wings of the plane. Min-Jae looked at the open hangar door, then at the police line, and finally at Zariah. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about his status or his reputation. He was looking at the woman he had crushed and the son he had just discovered. "I can't go, Zariah," Min-Jae said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engines. He gently unhooked her hand from his arm. "If I get on that plane, I'm just running away again. My mother needs to face justice, and I'm the only one who can testify to make it stick. If I don't stay and clean up the Kwon name, it will follow Leo for the rest of his life. He deserves a clean start, even if I'm not in it." Zariah looked at him, and for a fleeting second, she saw the man she had married, the one who wanted to be better than his father. She realized that by letting her go 5 years ago, he had lost his way, but by letting her go now, he was finally finding it. "I'll tell him about you," Zariah promised, her voice thick with emotion. "I won't tell him about the mafia boss or the man who called me boring. I'll tell him about the man who stood in front of a metal chair and a black SUV to save us." Min-Jae nodded, a single tear cutting a path through the dust on his cheek. "That's all I ask." Zariah turned and ran up the stairs. The heavy door of the private jet hissed shut, sealing out the sound of the sirens. As the plane began to taxi toward the runway, she looked out the small window. She saw Min-Jae standing alone on the tarmac, his hands raised as the FBI agents surrounded him. He didn't look like a defeated man. He looked like a man who was finally free. 6 months later, Zariah sat in her new office in London. The name on the door didn't say Kwon Global or Monroe Tech. It simply said ZM International. She had successfully merged her biotech firm with the remains of Min-Jae's legitimate business, creating a company that focused on saving lives instead of controlling them. A laptop sat open on her desk. On the screen was a news report from Los Angeles. Mrs. Kwon had been sentenced to 20 years for fraud and racketeering. Min-Jae, because of his full cooperation and the evidence Zariah provided, had received a much lighter sentence. community service, and a barred entry from the corporate world for a decade. He was currently working at a youth center in a quiet part of California. There was a knock on her door. Leo ran in, wearing a school uniform and carrying a drawing. "Look, Mommy, I drew the big plane." Zariah pulled him onto her lap. The boy was growing fast, and every day he looked more like a kinder version of the man she once knew. She looked at a letter sitting on her desk, postmarked from California. It was the first one she had opened. It wasn't a legal threat or a demand for money. It was a simple, handwritten note that said, "Thank you for being the person I wasn't brave enough to be. Take care of him." Zariah picked up her pen. She had one final document to sign. The papers that officially put all of Min-Jae's old assets into a trust for Leo, ensuring he would never have to rely on anyone else's power. As she signed her name, she realized that being boring had been her greatest strength. It was the quiet, steady fire that had outlasted the explosion of the Kwon Empire. She closed the folder, stood up, and took Leo's hand. "Come on, Leo. Let's go home." Min-Jae chose to go to jail to give his son a clean name, but he lost the chance to see him grow up. Did he make the right sacrifice? Or should he have taken Zariah's offer and fled to London? Let me know what you think in the comments. And subscribe for more.